Good afternoon and welcome to the ANANDA Developments PLC interim results investor presentation. Throughout this recorded meeting, investors will be in listen-only mode. Questions are encouraged, can be submitted at any time by the Q&A tab situated in the right-hand corner of your screen. Just click Q&A, scroll to the bottom, type your question and press send. The company may not be in a position to answer every question it receives during the meeting itself. However, the company can review all questions submitted today and publish responses where it's appropriate to do so. Before we begin, we'd like to submit the following poll. I'd now like to hand you over to Melissa Sturgis, CEO. Good afternoon.
Hi, Paul. Thank you for hosting us again, and hello to all our shareholders and interested parties. We had a really good session for our full year results back in end of July, I think we presented, and thought that it would be useful to make these updates a bit more regular on this forum. So hence we'll see you again now. So during this presentation, I'm going to focus on what has been going on more recently rather than a complete overview of the whole company. If you would like a complete overview of the whole company, please just get in contact with us and we can certainly go through every clinical trial that we're involved in. But I really want to focus on the epilepsy trial, which we recently announced today. So to kick off, we are a life sciences company focused on clinical development of CBD-based therapies for complex inflammatory pain conditions. Seems like quite a mouthful, but to drill down a little bit, when we talk about CBD-based therapies, what we don't mean is anything that you can buy in a pharmacy. We don't mean gummies. We don't mean anything like that. We don't mean topicals. And we don't mean unlicensed medicines as well. As I'm sure many of you who invest in medical cannabis are aware, there is an industry that is growing and prescribing unlicensed cannabis-based medicines. Our CBD-based drug development is solely focused around drugs that can ultimately be licensed. The reason for that from a UK perspective is that 85% of healthcare spend goes through the NHS. And so we believe that the best way to get cannabis-based medicines, CBD-based therapies to patients in need is via the MHRA regulated licensing route. So that's really what this company is all about. We think that is the best route for shareholders and definitely the best route for patients. So the background we're seeing more and more globally, and very interestingly recently in the US with the elections and the appointment of RFK Jr., there is a global push to look at what is going on with chronic inflammatory pain conditions. And so I think we're going to see a lot more noise and a lot more activity globally around therapies that can help these chronic inflammatory pain type conditions. Certainly in the UK, we know that we have an issue with people not being able to go to work and people having to rely on the NHS. And it seems that inflammation, chronic conditions, pain, comorbidities, multimorbidities, so more than one thing being wrong with a patient, are all increasingly issues that we're having to deal with in our healthcare system. And we think this is one of the main reasons the NHS and NICE has actually called for more research into cannabis-based medicines and CBD-based therapies, because they recognise that there is potential for these therapies to help in these areas. So if we just look at CBD, and I won't spend very much time, it's really worth remembering that CBD has multiple molecular and cellular mechanisms of action. Essentially what that means is it does lots of things. And what it tends to do is modulate many of the pathways, the inflammatory pathways and the immune system pathways to help restore balance or homeostasis in the body. Traditional drug development tends to revolve around one single molecule attacking one single target in the body, and so can be, and I'm generalizing, can be a bit of a sledgehammer effect or a sledgehammer result, if you like. So CBD has this incredible potential because it works in so many ways. I think that that has given CBD potentially it's been a bit misunderstood, because some people will say, well, hang on, if it does all these things, it must be snake oil, it can't be that good. But it is this modulating ability that CBD has, and helping to restore homeostasis in the body, which is really its strength. So we don't think about it as being snake oil. We think about it as being really a very interesting molecule for the next round of developing health outcomes for our patients and our communities in the UK, and obviously internationally. So our approach is very, very straightforward. We looked at what NICE said, the National Institute for Clinical and Healthcare Excellence. We looked at what they said, and they said in 2019, we think there is evidence, and some good evidence, for CBD and CBD-based therapies to help many chronic inflammatory pain type conditions. But what we don't have from an NHS perspective is enough evidence to be able to get these drugs onto the NHS formulary so that they can be prescribed through the NHS system. So we just looked at the call for action that NICE had made, or has made, and said, well, if we can answer those questions and provide the evidence, and the evidence is RCTs, randomized controlled trials, placebo-controlled, so where a patient will get the drug in its active form and will also get a placebo that's a nothing, to make sure the drug is actually working and making a difference. If we can do that work and provide the evidence and get some drugs licensed, then we have a pathway through to NHS prescribing. So really it's all about that. Huge unmet needs. I don't really need to labour that. But we are just answering the question that has been asked from NICE, and therefore from the NHS. I'm going to focus, as I said at the beginning, on our epilepsy trials. These are hugely important. They definitely have national significance, and our view is that they have global significance. Where do I start? In 2019, the government said that there would be some clinical trials which would look at some CBD and CBD formulations for the treatment of refractory epilepsies, and a broader range of refractory epilepsies than are covered by current licensed CBD drugs, and there is only one of them. It's taken a while for the government to find someone who can provide a formulation that can be used in a clinical trial, and we are very happy that the group that has been chosen to provide this formulation is us, through our subsidiary MRX. So we developed two formulations, MRX2, which is a CBD-based drug, and MRX2T, which is a CBD and THC-based drug. They have been requested by UCL in London, the university, which is running the trial with funding from the NIHR, which is the National Institute for Health and Care Research, and from NHS England. Our understanding is that the value of these trials is up to about £10 million. They are incredibly significant. And with the NHS funding these trials, it is clear that the objective is to end up with a medicine that can be prescribed on the NHS. So we're obviously intimately involved in all the work around that. Our drugs are currently being put through all the stability, all the standardization, all of the work that needs to be done prior to the dosing of patients. We understand from the university that that will start at the end of next year, but all of that development work needs to happen, and all of that sort of pre-testing type work needs to happen before those trials start. The university is paying for the drug to be delivered into the trials, so that will give ANANDA, MRX ANANDA, its first revenues as well. They are large trials across 18 centres throughout the UK. There will be 500 patients in total. And as I say, this is pretty significant. This is a world first to see a government fund trials of this nature. And based on, if we looked at the sales of epilepsy drugs in other parts of the world, the commercial prize for ANANDA is extraordinarily large. We mentioned there Epidiolex, which is the GW Pharmaceuticals drug, that did $736 million of sales in 2022, and those numbers are increasing rapidly. So if we can develop a drug, and obviously we're very confident we can do that, otherwise we wouldn't be involved in the trials, and we also have the track record of Epidiolex being so efficacious and achieving very large and significant revenues, we are very excited, and I have to say we're honoured to be involved in these trials and have the opportunity to develop this drug hand in hand with UCL, Great Ormond Street Hospital, and the NHS England. Epilepsy numbers, all of that is there. You can see that for yourselves. Basically, for us, it's obviously helping many patients. This trial has been such a long time in the talk and not in the action. So we are absolutely delighted that we have been able to provide a formulation that is suitable for these trials. I thought it would be useful, and I've taken this data from CBR Pharma, to think about if you're a private investor, and I sort of had this idea after being at the Aquis showcase, was earlier this week actually, when a couple of the companies who presented were giving a really good idea of, you know, what's the demand pool, what's the size of the market. So we can look at the size of the market in these particular drugs, but also as our loyal shareholders, and there are a number of you, and thank you for your support. As you know, we've sort of backed this idea that CBD drugs are really, CBD-based drugs are going to be a thing of the future. And this cumulative forecast for CBD drug approvals, which have been done, as I said, by CBR Pharma, I think is really interesting. I think it shows that we called it right. I think we called it early, but our spend has been really lean when you consider the amount of progress that we've made. So we're very comfortable with the amount of money that we've spent to get to this point. And if CBR Pharma's data is anything close to accurate, we really are at the beginning of what is going to be an incredible time for CBD-based drugs. And if I reflect back to the beginning of this presentation, it's about chronic complex inflammatory pain conditions. So it feels to me as though we're on the cusp of a wave, and that looks like quite a nice wave. CBR have also done another bit of analysis, and I think this is also absolutely fascinating. So API stands for active pharmaceutical ingredient, and CBR Pharma has looked at and forecast based on what it is seeing in clinical trials, the growth in clinical trials, a whole lot of other data sets that it's pulled together. It's anticipating this growth in demand for CBD active pharmaceutical ingredient in kilograms over the next 10 years. And again, we're seeing the same story. As we're seeing an increase in research using this CBD molecule, the development of drugs is going to increase, the number of licensed drugs is going to increase, and obviously to facilitate all of that, the amount of CBD active pharmaceutical ingredient is also going to massively increase. So my point is that if we look at the work we're doing, the call for work from NICE, we look at what's happening in the US, and I think that is really significant for the future of CBD-based drugs and this whole area. And then we pull these other data points together, the demand for API and the potential increase in licensed drugs. I think we're starting to see the story that we really put our hearts and souls behind a few years ago. So I'm not going to go through the other trials because I wanted to really focus on epilepsy, and I wanted to give a few slides on sort of the macro background for why I think our timing is now looking pretty good. The information on our other trials into endometriosis and chemotherapy-induced pain, and our work, our pharmacokinetic work on MRX1, and our mice study on heart, HFpEF heart, they're all in our larger decks, which are on the website and which we can provide you with. But as I said, I wanted to have a good chat about epilepsy and not take up too much of everyone's time. The board, hopefully everyone knows the board. The key points are Charles Morgan. He was the founding funder of a company called Clarity Pharmaceuticals, which is now has a market cap of about $2.5 billion and is listed on the Australian Stock Exchange. He started funding that about, I think, 15 years ago. So it's very, very good track record in identifying early stage opportunities. I'll also bring everyone's attention to Professor Clive Page, who is a pharmacologist at King's College and was the founder and initial chairman of Verona Pharmaceuticals, Verona Pharma, I think it's called, which is now NASDAQ quoted and has just had a drug licensed by the FDA. So they're probably the main guys to speak about. Jeremy, obviously, you see very much at our presentations and on screen. Make sure that we spend our money wisely. So they're sort of the key people, and obviously our NEDs give us a lot of support and guidance. And the Scientific Advisory Board, I think I've mentioned this before, but it's worth stating again that now that we're at a point we've developed these formulations, we can see a clear path through clinical trials. Our drugs in clinical trials are getting funding from the government, which means we get the opportunity to learn a lot. It's non-dilutive funding, and the fact that we're being funded by the government gives us that sort of third-party endorsement and confidence that what we're doing is right. We're now saying, okay, let's build out the business a bit more with some more pharmaceutical brains. And we formed a scientific advisory board. Professor Page chairs that. We are very fortunate to have Professor Trevor Jones, Cherry Wainwright, and Professor Mari Fallon involved in that. And Charlie sits on that board, that scientific advisory board as well. He has been a lot of the impetus for the ideas and the drug development ideas that ANANDA has had. So top 10 shareholders, we are a very closely held company still. So that is a good thing in my view. We all have a lot of reason to be here and make this work. You can see the other shareholders there, mostly at the moment, private client shareholders, private clients who have supported us in previous ventures and are long-term holders. And we also have, again, I would like to thank our Telegram group shareholders who are active and hugely supportive. We do not have a business if we don't have private investors. So thanks for your support and your continued questioning of us and our strategy. You can see the rest of it there. I think the other thing I should mention is we raised some money a few months ago. So currently the balance sheet looks healthy. We tidied up the debt. So we're now in a pretty good shape to do the development work that we need to do on all these trials and progress our activities nicely. In summary, our lead trial is very much, and I suppose that means our lead assets very much are MRX2 and MRX2T. Being involved in phase 3 trials is pretty extraordinary. The fact that they're NHS funded and that they will be our drugs to take through regulatory approval and pricing discussions with NICE, with the objective of them ultimately being available on the NHS is pretty cool. We are just answering the question, addressing unmet needs. We do get this fast track because we're dealing with a molecule that's already known and already has a lot of safety data around it. We're able to progress these trials very quickly. Rather than having to start back in the test tube all the time, we can start with trials in humans. We will get some initial revenues in 2025 from supplying the drug to the epilepsy trials. And we also have a strong pipeline. You know, we're not just looking at epilepsy, as you know, and as I've mentioned in this presentation, we're involved in chemotherapy-induced pain and endometriosis, and doing some additional bulking up work around our formulations so that when we get to the point of speaking to the regulator about licensing, we've got a lot more data that sits around the formulations. As always, we're getting a really good response now from our Investor Hub, so please do sign up. We're getting regular questions, and one of our ambitions that is the reason for having the Investor Hub is so that we have a direct conversation with our shareholders, that we're not always going through an intermediary or a private client broking platform or whatever, that if you have questions, you can speak to us. If we would like to tell you something, we can tell you on the platform. And we also do use that platform to provide other insights that we think you might be interested in as shareholders who are interested in CBD and CBD therapies and the particular indications that we're focused on. The disclaimer as always. And that is the end of my presentation. Thank you very much for listening, and I will go back to Paul. Thanks, Paul.
Thank you very much indeed, Melissa, and thanks for updating investors today. Ladies and gentlemen, please do continue to submit your questions just using the Q&A tab situated on the right-hand corner of your screen. But just while Melissa takes a few moments to review those questions submitted today, I'd like to remind you the recording of the presentation, along with a copy of the slides and the published Q&A, can be accessed via your investor dashboard. Melissa, as you can see, we've had several questions that have come through from investors, and thank you to all the investors for submitting those. If I may just ask you just to click on that Q&A tab where appropriate to do so, read out the question and give you a response, and I'll pick up from you at the end.
Thanks, Paul. First question, what steps are you taking to streamline regulatory approval in the UK and potentially internationally? Good question. So in the UK, we have started on all of our trials and drug candidates and conditions. We have already started engaging with our regulatory consultants and also with what's called health technology assessment, I think that's the right word, which is basically the pricing side of things. So we've already started to engage with the regulatory pathway and the pricing pathway. And what that effectively does for us is it signals to us early on if there's anything that we should be doing in the trials to make sure we can tick particular boxes when it comes to getting approvals. So we're very cognizant that those two things need to happen. The pricing and the regulatory work streams need to happen almost in parallel with the development of the trials. So that is happening. And from an international perspective, I know that the work that the guys, so I should have a bit of a shout out to Nick and Jack and Jeremy for all the work that they do day to day to really make these trials happen and get up. The work that we're doing in Australia at the moment is all done to a standard that is sort of acceptable, if you like, to the FDA regulatory process as well. So whilst some of the FDA approvals are different, we have our mind on the US, absolutely, because that's the biggest market in the world. And from an epilepsy perspective, that's where the largest sale of epilepsy, CBD-based epilepsy drugs is happening. So it would be silly for us not to look at that market. In terms of sort of speed to market, one of the things we think is the right strategy at the moment is that once we get to the end of phase 2, and obviously with the epilepsy trials, they're already phase 3, but once we start to get really good data out of the phase 2 trials and those phase 3 trials, we think the best approach for us is going to be to take the trials all the way through, take the drugs all the way through to licensing in the UK, and look to out-license for other jurisdictions. So as everyone knows, we are a small team, and so it makes sense that we own, if you like, the UK, and then we out-license potentially for other jurisdictions. So hopefully that answers that question. Second question, how does MRX2 and 2T formulations compare with existing cannabinoid medicines? Another good question. Both the formulations are patent pending, so I'm not going to give you too much information about them. But basically, they are based on CBD, as is, for example, Epidiolex, but the way they are formulated is different, and all the standardization, all the supply chain, all of the very detailed technical work that has to go into developing a drug that can be licensed, all of that work is obviously unique to our two drugs. So I hope that answers the question without me telling you exactly what it is. You know, the important thing is that we build a moat around our drugs, and the moat can come in a couple of forms. One part of the moat is a patent, and a really important part of the moat is actually a license for that drug to be used to treat a particular indication. So you can't just switch out, as we all know, when we go to the doctor, you get prescribed a drug for a particular indication. You can't just say, oh, well, I can use something that someone told me about because it's similar or it's supposedly the same. It's not the same because it hasn't gone through clinical trials. It hasn't been proven in an RCT setting. So it will be unique. Our drugs are unique because they will be the drugs in these clinical trials, and these are the drugs that will go through to licensing. So it's really important, I think, in this area that we understand that a license for a drug is as important as a patent, because that gives you exclusivity to treat the condition. Milestones to see from the trial and assuming a success, timelines to market. I'm going to be really boring on that one and answer it, but not answer it. At the moment, I know it's really frustrating. We don't want to give timelines and expectations. We will try to give more information about what to expect, but right now, as we're getting these trials ready and we're learning so much all the time, we don't want to mismanage your expectations. And so instead of talking about expected timelines, what we're hoping to do is provide you with more and more robust information about what we are doing and what we have achieved. And then as we become very confident in the next hurdle that we're going to meet, we can then talk more about what that might look like in terms of time and shape and whatever. What I can say is on the 2 phase 2 trials into chemotherapy pain and endometriosis, the next step is ethics approval. So going through that process so that they get the drugs and the trials get the final tick off, and then they move from there into patient dosing. The trials in Australia, again, we're finalising the drug to make sure it's ready to be shipped to Australia. So that's sort of the next milestone on that piece of work. And on the epilepsy trials, I think I spoke to that in a fair amount of detail earlier on, that we're doing all of the work to get the drug into a position where it can be have all the standardization and all the documents and standard operating procedures put around it so that it can be signed off for use in the trials. So I know I haven't completely answered that, and I apologize, but not apologize, that that we just want to get it right, and try and build the value with real milestones as we progress. So thank you for those 3 questions, and thank you for tuning in at 12:30 on a Friday. I appreciate that. Paul, back to you.
That's fantastic. Look, thanks for covering off those questions. Of course, any further questions come through, Melissa will be able to review those and we'll publish responses where it's appropriate to do so. Just before redirecting investors to provide you with their feedback, Melissa, which I know is particularly important to you and the team, could I just ask you for a few closing comments, please?
Thanks, Paul. Yes, we are hugely excited and feeling very confident that we've chosen the right path for this business and that we are on the right track. And I cannot emphasize enough how much work goes on behind the scenes that shareholders don't always see. We have learnt a lot about the detailed involvement, the details that are involved in bringing drug trials to fruition. And I assure you that we are all absolutely determined to continue on the path where we are on. And I must say, on a macro level, I am looking at what's going on in the US, and I think that we're going to take some inspiration. I hope we're going to take some inspiration in the UK from the idea that we really need to get behind these chronic inflammatory pain conditions, and that these CBD-based drugs can really be very helpful in that area. And thank you for your support, and please keep asking questions. Thanks, Paul.
Fantastic. Melissa, look, thanks indeed for updating investors. That's great. Could I please ask investors not to close the session, as you now be automatically redirected to provide your feedback in order to listen, the team can better understand your views and expectations. This will only take a few moments to complete and it'll be greatly valued by the team. On behalf of the management team at ANANDA Developments PLC, I'd like to thank you for attending today's presentation. That concludes today's session, and good afternoon to you all.